Noticed in the painting. So tell us about this space and how you're able to have a show here.
So the person that owned this building, his name was Dick Bruce, and I met him probably a couple of decades ago. He originally came out here, I would assume, like with Thomas McWayne back in the early 70s, and he was incredibly generous to me. I've had thousands of paintings stored in the back of this building for way more than a decade. And Dink died last fall, and I don't know what's going to happen to this building. And his niece and nephew are kind enough to let me put up this show. And that's how I ended up being able to do this. Also, the fact that I don't have to go get any paintings, I just have to walk over behind that door right there and grab them. So when I take it down, I don't have to haul this work anywhere, hopefully.
Yeah, I think you'd have to hire a semi to move some of these giant paintings any further. So let's go back to the beginning. Growing up, were you interested in art?
Well, I would have been interested in art only as a viewer. My grandmother was painted and my great-grandfather painted, so I was always fascinated with the process of watching them paint. And then growing up here, yeah, the only art I would have been exposed to would have been Charlie Russell and perhaps Frederick Remington and a little bit of Chatham, but not so much Chatham.
But did you sketch or do any art yourself?
So I only sketched, like doodling in high school and making cartoons in school books and such.
But all of your homework had Edd Enders drawing.
But no interest at all in being an artist, and that was not as near as socially acceptable when I grew up as it is now. Like that wouldn't have been a cool thing to do, to be a painter.
And it's not something you thought
It's
about
not
doing.
really that cool now.
It's pretty hot.
A whole bunch of people ask me all the time what I do for a living, other than having the hobby as a painter. Like it's not, even now, it's not that socially acceptable. It's much more so here than it used to be, but still, it's a tough road.
How was your time as a backcountry guide and working on ranches as well as hunting and fishing influenced your art?
Well, growing up here in Montana, when I grew up, I worked on archaeological survey crews, so I worked all over the northern plains and the northern Rockies. And after I got out of high school, I worked as a hunting guide all over Montana, in Idaho, Alaska. I worked on horse ranches and huge cattle ranches. I roughnecked on oil rigs. All of that stuff is part of what I'm painting. It's part of me.
And what is your connection to nature in those experiences?
Well, hopefully you can see the connection in the paintings that I do, what the connection is. Right.
What did you learn about art and your place in it when you were studying it at MSU?
So after about a decade of traveling all over and working out in the environment in rural areas in the West and never being really happy, one winter I was spending the winter in Gallatin Gateway, and then I decided to take an art class. So I took an art class, and then I took another art class, and then I started studying about art history. And when I grew up here, like if a young person or any person now, you could tap in and look at the collection at the National Gallery of Art or any major museum. But when I grew up, my parents weren't rich enough, or even if they had been rich enough, they wouldn't have taken me to a museum on the East Coast or someplace. So by going to college And studying art history, I learned about all of these other artists that have an important role in all different kinds of things.
And what artists in particular have influenced your work?
I think if you guys look through those self-portraits, you'll see like the earliest ones are pretty you can see the influence of Van Gogh. And when my mom and dad have one of my self-portraits. I have over 50. My mom and dad have one that was done back in that day, and when I look at it, I know that it's based off of a Cézanne self-portrait. And back in the day, that really bothered me, and I really got hammered in college. But now I know that all art is based on art, so I just use that as a departure point.
How do you divide your time when you're crafting your art, and what do you enjoy about that process?
Okay, so I've always tried to work unless I'm out playing somewhere or working for somebody. Or I've always tried to work about 40 hours a week. So if you average that out in a month, 160 hours, probably 80 hours of that is sizing or building stretchers, sizing, priming, and stretching canvas. And maybe out doing some sketching. Actual painting time is like less than half of my time.
So what does sizing and stretching mean for those of us who aren't familiar with that?
Okay, so oil paint cannot come into direct contact with raw canvas or paper because linseed oil has acid in it. So by sizing the canvas, which is pretty close to being like gelatin, it's actually rabbit skin glue. So you build up a portion of that, and then I size the canvas, and that impregnates the canvas with that size, and it puts like a microscopic layer between the oil paint and the canvas to keep the canvas from rotting. That process has been around since about the 1400s. So most people that paint oil paintings now, they use an acrylic gesso. And that is an inert substance. So that does the same thing, but I like the process of doing that because it gives me a lot of physical exercise and it gives me time to think about what I might want to work on.
Excellent. So what is your intention when depicting the West?
I'm not interested at all in romanticizing the West in any way. So my goal would be to give my view of the time and the place that we're living in right now. So therefore, if I was going to paint like a Western scene, I'd go to Lane Gear and do a sketch. Right? Because I'm also only interested in paintings, humans' interaction with the environment. So you won't see, like in all of my paintings, you'll see man-made things like, I'm just looking over there, there's train cars and fence lines and power poles and such.
What has influenced the changes in your process, style, and color palette over the years?
Well, I think if you look around, you can see where I've gone through different periods, and some of them might be a little bit darker than other periods. So there's that. But when I look at the work over that 30-year time period, I think that my paintings are getting much tighter, and also they're a lot more sophisticated. I think my work has gotten stronger, my more recent work.
And do you want to say anything about this new Catalonian color palette you're working in and some of the surreal work that is seen in the other room where you're using primary colors?
Okay. So, well, I've studied art history a bunch, so I know about Western art. And a couple years ago, Chris and I went to Barcelona, and of course in Barcelona you had back in the 20s and the 30s, a big surrealist movement. And so I got to see all this work by Picasso, Miro, Dali, and a bunch more. And so I think then hopefully you can see that influence in there with those cattle and signs and such. And with the colorful palette. So in the past, I've always tried to use as many different colors as I could within a painting. And after going on that trip, now it's pretty much the primary colors I'm working in. So those paintings back in that room, you'll see they're yellow and blue and red. And so I found that very difficult because to make something work just with that limited palette.
Ed loves a challenge in his paintings. Tell us about your relationship to cottonwood trees. For instance, you have named all these paintings cottonwood number. What number are you on for cottonwood number?
Well, I'm up near about 300.
So let's talk about cottonwoods.
So cottonwood trees, to me, are very representative of the Northern Plains and the Northern Rockies. There are 4 different kinds of cottonwood trees. 3 of them live in Montana. And I find, working and living all over the West, that the cottonwood tree is, to me, that's like the emblem of the Northern Plains and the Northern Rockies. And cottonwood trees have a very figurative or humanistic quality to me. They almost, especially if they're off by themselves, they almost look kind of like a person, depending on, how far you stretch things.
So speaking of people, what has compelled you to do self-portraits over the years, and what do they convey?
Well, I had never had any intentions at all of ever showing any self-portraits. And I think I have at least 50 or 60 that I've done over the last 30 years. In the beginning, I was just learning how to paint. And that's why I probably was studying Van Gogh. I studied Cezanne and stuff. But then taking art history, I learned that artists have done self-portraits for hundreds and hundreds of years. And because I lived alone for over 20 years, and I mean that's the easiest subject there is a self-portrait. You don't get any, if you're having troubles figuring out something to paint, paint a self-portrait. You're right there. And then after about a decade, and I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. I've got, I could actually see, the change. Then I just kept doing it. So I've been painting a couple of them every year for 30 years. So that makes about 60 that I probably have.
And what role do they play between the other paintings?
Well, I think that you might see that I pushed things a little farther with the self-portraits for one reason or another. I think I've experimented probably a little bit more on them than I have the other work that I've done. And like I said, I had no intentions of ever showing them to anybody. And many of the ones that I have are pretty dark. I probably wouldn't care to show them.
And what you've said over the years is that when you're stuck on another painting that you're working on, you switch to a self-portrait as a place to kind of put your brain while you're figuring out the puzzle of the next painting.
Keeps one painting.
Is your compositional process different for urban scenes than rural?
Not at all. Not at all. When I am doing you'll see like in most all of my paintings that I have a diagonal. Like right, I'm looking at, whoops. I'm looking at this painting right here. I've got a diagonal there, I've got a diagonal there. There's a diagonal there. What a diagonal does is that tends to pull the viewer into the composition. So whether it's a diagonal on the edge of a building or a fence line or a road or whatever it is, you'll find like there's a diagonal of some kind probably in every painting here. That is not anything that I invented. That's something that those post-impressionists invented back in the day, I just stole it. The other thing that I do on a painting is I replicate shapes. So I'll just say here I've got this shape going here, this shape going here, that's replicated in these clouds. You could look at like all these paintings, there's replication of shapes, and what that does is that makes your eye go around the entire canvas. I didn't invent that either.
Do you want to say anything about some of the recurring themes in your paintings? Roads, ravens, the new rabbit. A lot of people have been asking questions about the Run, Rabbit, Run series of surreal paintings.
Yeah, so I did a whole series. Any paintings that you see in here, I probably have 10 more, because every bunch of paintings I'll do a series. So I just sort of tried to pull out a couple from each series. But on that Rabbit Run thing, that appears in a lot of rock and roll music from back in the day. And I'm thinking specifically of the song Breathe by Pink Floyd. It's going Run, Rabbit, Run. And there's a whole bunch of different definitions for that. Some of them are pretty negative. But the definition that I'm going to use is the one that Pink Floyd used, and that is that most people put their head in the hole, or you can run. You only live once, so you might just as well run as far as you can. That's my definition.
What legacy would you like to leave with your art?
I don't have the only legacy that I care to leave is maybe people in 100 years, they'll say that this person painted what he saw and what he was living at the time for this little teeny piece of the world that we live in right here.
We want to give a shout out to Glenn's Tavern down the block for partnering with some of the wine. Those of you who are familiar with Ed's office at Glenn's have seen his, there's more paintings there, and many of them are from this particular series where he did the same tree every month of the year. And so we encourage you to grab drinks and food there, because we pretty much just have water and wine and no Christ.
And you can bring drinks back here from over there. And I wanted hopefully to support the businesses, the local businesses in the town. So hopefully you'll go spend some money.
Does anyone have a question? Yes, we have a question
I
here
have
from
a question in
Karen.
particular for Ed.
Oh, awesome.
So, are any of your paintings abstract or out of the imagination? You said you stole that diagonal. It wasn't your idea. You
Pretty
stole
much
it.
everything.
So,
Like there's a lot of imagination in everything.
okay.
So like this painting right here, when I went and did the sketch, I would have had just the sketch of the building.
Okay.
And I'm gonna have to resolve, like I needed to resolve this big open area here. And so that's all out of my head, that dog, that truck, that person, all those people. Only in a compositional way to activate those spaces.
Very cool.
Ed, do you feel we all feel with our jobs, sometimes we're more excited, sometimes we're less excited. Are you always compelled to paint, or do you have to make yourself sometimes?
If I don't paint, I would be in trouble. It's basically, I don't find it fun, and I don't find it anything. It's just that's what I have to do to take care of this energy that I have, and it can be very, very negative or very, very positive. But if I didn't have a way to put that into paint and canvas, it would probably not be very good for society.
Heck yeah.
So I'm gonna